Okay, we are live. Well, hello everyone. This is the live streaming channel of Blackheath Philosophy Forum, which is a community group based in the Upper Blue Mountains, New South Wales, Australia. We've been arranging public discussion forums on philosophical topics for some years now, and holding our meetings in windy halls. The COVID virus has dragged us into the 21st century, and so we're now live streaming all our talks, and it's pretty enjoyable actually. And it actually gives us all sorts of options, like having international guests we could never do before. If you want to be kept abreast of what we're doing, you can join our email list. There's a link in the description below. And we're delighted to have as our first international guest, Dr Gad Saad, who will be coming to us from Montreal. He's a university professor and evolutionary psychologist and hosts the popular and provocative YouTube channel, the Saad Truth. So not one of those boring academics, right? So he's got an interesting name. The Saad Truth is channel, but I did toy with the idea of introducing him as the Marquis, but I thought he might get offended by that, so I thought better of it. I recommend you check out his channel. It's very interesting. And he's well known for his eloquent defences of free speech, reason, debate, and the scientific method, and a scathing critic of modern academic fashions like post-modernism. So you may be wondering, how on earth did a character like this survive in modern academia? Good question. He's got a book coming out on the 6th of October, which he'll be talking about. It's called The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. And you can pre-order on the Australian Amazon website by clicking the link in the description below. He argues that an epidemic of idea pathogens are killing common sense in the West and undermining liberal civilization. Very much in line with our theme for this year's series of talks. He's an evolutionary biologist at the John Molson School of Business at Concordia University. He held the Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioural Sciences and Darwinian Consumption from 2008 to 2018. So I'll interview Gad, and as usual, you can post your reactions and queries in the comments below. I should say Gad, for family reasons, will have to depart us after about an hour. On the chat, please keep it concise, relevant, non-repetitive, and polite. Anything not meeting these criteria will be ignored. So welcome, Gad. I wonder if we could begin by, if you could give us a bit of an outline of your family history and how you came to be in Canada and where you came from originally, and what interested you in the field of evolutionary psychology. Sorry.
Right.
So I'll now give you the floor.
Well, thank you for the very kind invitation and introduction, Peter. I'm delighted to be here. I spent 7 weeks in Australia and New Zealand back in 2001, my first sabbatical leave. And I loved the place. And I was hoping to return this year as part of a speaking tour, but regrettably, a virus had other ideas. So maybe we'll do it in the future. So to answer your question, I was born in Lebanon. We were part of the last remaining Jewish community in Lebanon. Not too many were left because, it became increasingly precarious to be Jewish in the Arab world. But Lebanon was still somewhat of a microcosm of tolerance with some, quotes. And then in 1975, when the Civil War broke out, it became very, very difficult to be in Lebanon, irrespective of your religion. But certainly, if you were Jewish, it wasn't a good thing to be in Lebanon. And so we had to escape very quickly. We moved to Montreal. I grew up there from the age of 11, did my first 2 degrees in Montreal, and then I left to Cornell University. So this is going to answer now, how did I get interested in evolutionary psychology? So when I left to Cornell, it was with the intention of studying consumer behavior. At first, it was going to be as a mathematical modeler because I had a mathematics background. And then my eventual doctoral supervisor, who is a cognitive and mathematical psychologist, suggested that I take a course titled Advanced Social Psychology. And in that course, the professor, his name is Professor Regan, assigned a book called Homicide by two of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, a husband and wife team, Margot Wilson and Martin Daly. And in this book, they used the evolutionary lens to explain universal patterns of criminality. And the explanatory power of the evolutionary lens struck me as so parsimonious, so coherent, had so much explanatory power that I had my epiphany. I would apply the evolutionary lens to study behavior in general and consumer behavior in particular. And that's what led me down that path.
Okay, well, thank you. And just one quick query. I gather a criticism sometimes advanced of evolutionary psychology is that it tends to be overly reductive. In other words, trying to find an adaptive explanation for everything that every personality trait or idea. Do you have any quick response to that? We might talk about it a bit.
Sure.
More detail later.
Now, is it normal that I can't see you, or is there a glitch in the program?
No. It's if you'd like to see me, here I am.
Yeah, I think maybe a bit easier rather than. I mean, I am exceptionally good looking, and I love to stare at myself, but it would be nice to be able to look at you.
Sure. That's easily arranged.
So, yes, there is a very long list of detractors of evolutionary psychology. So, for example, some religious folks will hate evolutionary psychology for the same reasons that they hate evolution in general. If you offer a materialist explanation for something that should be divine, well, then you are going against God. All sorts of academics will hate evolutionary psychology because it attacks their fundamental paradigm. So, for example, if you are a social constructivist, which basically means that you believe that everything is due to a social construction. Why do men like this type of women? Well, they learned it from Hollywood images. Why do women like this type of man? Well, they learned it by reading romance novels. Everything is due to a social construction. We're born empty plates, right? Tabula rasa, empty minds. And it's only socialization that makes us who we are. So for all sorts of ideological reasons, people, have issues with evolutionary psychology. The problem with all of these, I mean, we could certainly spend a couple of hours dismantling each of, these kinds of, concerns. But the problem is that there is no alternative to explaining the evolution of the human mind other than evolutionary theory, right? In the same way that evolution is used to explain the behavior, the morphological features of every single species that exists, it doesn't somehow magically escape when it comes to humans, right? Now, some people will be charitable to say, well, I accept evolution if you restrict it to the explanation of why we have opposable thumbs. But I won't accept evolution or evolutionary psychology if it's for something that comes above the neck. The mind somehow comes from some magical forces. It's due to culture, it's due to learning, it's due to socialization. That's it. That's what I call flat earthers of the human mind. In other words, history is not going to look very kindly on these people. Evolutionary psychologists do a very simple thing. They take evolutionary biological principles and they apply them to the study of the human mind. It's not reductionist because, for example, evolutionary psychologists recognize that everything that we are is an interaction between our environment and our genes. So, for example, specific genes are turned on or off because of environmental inputs. So the idea that you are being biologically deterministic if you use an evolutionary principle to explain something is simply advertising that you know nothing about biology. So each of these concerns have been repeatedly dismantled by each new generation of evolutionary psychologists, and yet they keep rising like the eternal phoenix. So it's a bit frustrating because it's almost as if you can never slay the dragon of stupidity permanently.
Okay, thank you. Now, you've got a book coming up which is very provocative, and it's going to be a lot of concern. A lot of could be banned in some quarters. I wonder if you could outline the thesis of your book, which people can pre-order using the link below.
Thank you. So I basically take, I hate to say fortuitous that we're currently going through the global pandemic, because it kind of puts on the top of the mind of people what an epidemiologist does, right? So what does an epidemiologist or virus hunter, what does he do, or she, what do they do? So they look for where a virus began, where is the place where it started, how it proliferated, and then we explore how we might vaccinate people, inoculate people against the virus. So I take exactly the same approach, but except of talking about biological viruses, biological pathogens, actual brain parasites, I argue that humans could be parasitized by another class of agents. They're called idea pathogens. They're bad ideas that can completely parasitize us into engaging in clearly maladaptive behavior. So let me draw an analogy first with other animals. So some of your viewers might have heard of Toxoplasma gondii, which is a parasite which, when it infects the brains of mice, the mice lose their innate fear of cats. They actually become sexually attracted to the cat's urine, because the parasite wants the mouse to go to the cat because it helps it complete its reproductive cycle. There's another type of parasite that attacks the brains of ungulates, deer, moose, elk. And when those animals' brains are parasitized by this particular brainworm, they engage in what's called circling behavior. So they start literally going around in a small circle, unable to extricate from that motor movement, even if the looming predators are coming towards them. So rather than fleeing, they are stuck in this perpetual circling motion. So I take this idea and I argue, well, humans, of course, can also be parasitized by actual brain worms, but they can also be parasitized by dreadful idea pathogens. So I explain how these idea pathogens came to be. They all arose from an ecosystem called the university, because it takes intellectuals to come up with truly stupid ideas. And then once these ideas proliferate, then I look at what are some of the downstream effects of being parasitized by these idea pathogens. And then if I've done a good job, I offer some ways by which we can inoculate ourselves from these dreadful ideas.
Okay, well, could you elaborate a bit on the dreadful, which specific dreadful ideas do you have in mind?
So I actually go through.
Being politically incorrect, please. We don't want to get banned by YouTube.
Well, I don't think we'll be banned, because I already have about 6 years worth of clips. Sometimes my clips are demonetized, but knock on wood, nothing's so far. Yeah, not yet. So let me give you, a couple of idea pathogens. So the granddaddy of them all, and I think you alluded to it in your very kind introduction, is postmodernism, because it is what I call intellectual terrorism. It is anti-science. It is anti-logic. It is anti-reason. It is basically negating the possibility that an objective truth exists. Only my truth matters. There are no objective truths. Well, you could imagine how a scientist might have a problem with this, because we wake up in the morning thinking that there are truths out there. Now, in science, everything is provisionally true. In other words, what is true today, tomorrow someone might falsify, and then we have to have the epistemic humility to recognize that, and then we're back to the drawing board. But we do believe that there are truths that we can, uncover. And I'll give you a quick story that's probably now quite infamous, but many of your viewers might not know it. So about almost 20 years ago now, I had gone out to dinner with a doctoral student of mine who had just defended his PhD. And we had gone out to celebrate, myself, my wife, him, and his date at the time. And he warned me that his date was a ardent postmodernist, a cultural anthropology type, and a radical feminist. So kind of a trio of bullshit. And so he basically said, can you sort of, please keep it calm? I said, oh, absolutely. Mum's the word. I'll be on my best behavior, which of course was a nonsensical promise, because I wasn't going to keep calm. And so in the conversation at one point, I engaged this lady, and I said, oh, I hear that you are a postmodernist. She goes, yes. I said, okay, well, so postmodernists, there are no universal truths, correct? Yes, no universal truths. Okay. How about would it be possible for me to offer you what I consider to be some universal truths, and then you could explain to me how they're not universal truths? She said, absolutely, go for it. I said, okay, is it absolutely true that within Homo sapiens, only women bear children? Now, this is before the whole current trans activism where boys can menstruate, right?
Dangerous terrain there.
What's that?
Getting into dangerous terrain there.
No. Well, let's see. So then I said, okay, so is it true? She said, no, absolutely not true. Okay, so it's not true that only women can bear children. How so? She said, well, there is some Japanese tribe off some island where within their mythological narrative, within their folklore, their mythology, it is the men who bear children. So by you restricting the conversation to the material realm, this is how you could pigeonhole us into saying that only women bear children. So once I recovered from my mini stroke because of what she had just said, I then asked her, okay, let's not cover something that is as complicated and as controversial as only women can bear children. Is it true? Is the following cosmological fact true, that from the vantage point of Earth, only sailors have relied on the fact that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west? And so there she used Jacques Derrida's deconstructionism. And she said, well, I don't play labels. What you consider east and west, I call something else. What you call the sun, I call dancing hyena. To which I answered, no problem. The dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. To which she said, I don't play those games. That's postmodernism. She wasn't an outlier. She was simply aping and mimicking what generations of students have been parasitized into stating. When you are unable to have a conversation about what the sun is and whether only women bear children, that's an idea pathogen. That serves no purpose other than being intellectual terrorism. So that would be one. I'll give you one other, and if you want more, we can discuss other ones. Biophobia is another example of an idea pathogen. Biophobia is what I call the fear of using biology to explain human behavior. So this very much relates to my evolutionary psychology work. The type of repulsion that some supposed academics have at the thought that maybe humans might be biological beings who are under the purview of our hormones, our physiology, something other than culture, is complete heretical to them. That's an idea pathogen. So I basically take a whole cocktail of these idea pathogens, I demonstrate how they came to be, and then I offer ways by which we can defeat them.
There was a terrible microaggression in Britain recently. Somebody put up a poster in multiple locations around a university, it might have been Oxford, which said, woman, an adult female human. That's what it said.
Wow.
It just happens to be the Oxford, the Oxford dictionary definition of a woman, an adult female human. This led to a police investigation.
Yeah. Well, listen, there is no end to this type of lunacy. In 2017, I appeared in front of the Canadian Senate because I was testifying about a bill that's called Bill C-16, which has since passed its law. Bill C-16 is a bill that seeks, at the time sought to incorporate gender identity and gender expression within, under the rubric of hate crimes. And of course, not that I need to preface this because it should be clear to anybody who knows me, I fully support the right of all individuals, including trans people, to live free of bigotry, free of discrimination. No one should have to, face such ugliness. That doesn't mean, though, that in the pursuit of this laudable objective, we should murder truth. We should rape common sense in the pursuit of that goal. So similar to, for example, what some radical feminists do, we should all support the idea that men and women should be perfectly equal under the law. But in the pursuit of that goal, that doesn't mean we are indistinguishable beings. But that's what they try to argue. Because by arguing that we are indistinguishable beings, they wrongly think that that could at least try to dismantle any sexism that's around. So again, we could all pursue justice and liberty and freedom of bigotry for all without creating edifices of bullshit, if you excuse the term.
If I could just go to taking up to epidemiology language, you've talked about one of the, I think they call them disease vectors, don't they? Academia, you've mentioned. What about social media? This seems to be the gigantic force multiplier of all this sort of crap. That sort of, so, you know, you're familiar with the case of Sir Tim Hunt, the British molecular biologist, who, based on a misreport of a slightly off-color joke, this guy who was the Nobel laureate in medicine, basically had his career destroyed by Twitter virtually overnight after you know, a speech he gave to a conference of women scientists in Seoul in South Korea. He got on the plane, literally at the time he was flying from Seoul back to London. His career was destroyed. This is one of the most eminent scientists of the age. I mean, anybody's vulnerable to this stuff.
Well, I'm glad you raised that example, because I actually covered this example in my forthcoming book. I actually go through a whole bunch of these cases where, exactly as you said, someone made a rather inoffensive, innocuous joke, and there goes their career. Look, social media is both a magical opportunity and an abyss of infinite darkness, right? It's magical in that it allows us to meet up with people that our lives would have otherwise never intersected. I've had the pleasure of not only meeting, you know, endless amount of fans that are, you know, just absolutely lovely folks that I've been enriched by, but even people. I mean, I've met my musical hero, the lead singer of the Stylistics, a top group from the 1960s and 70s. I was a little boy in Lebanon. You know, he'd be singing in my ear. I actually met him. He came on my show, and we've become friends. And it was through the magic of the interconnectedness of social media that this could happen. You and I are having this conversation today. You're in Australia, the furthest possible place from Montreal, and there are people listening to us because of these technological platforms. The problem with, of course, social media is that, as you said, it amplifies the ugly parts of the human heart, right? So if in the past, if you had a bully at high school, then your tormentors might be restricted to 2, 3, 4 people, and you knew their physical space. That was in high school. As long as you got home, you were safe. The next day when you'd go to school, those 3 or 4 tormentors might come after you. Well, now the tormentors are all over the world, and instead of 2 or 3 of them, there is 2 or 3,000 or 20 or 30,000. So it's a very, very difficult situation. And I can tell you that as someone who, for better or worse, has become the central repository of these first-person testimonies. What I mean by that is I receive, you know, unimaginable number of emails from professors, from students, from parents of students who are writing to me, sharing with me their story, their horror, what they're facing. It's heartbreaking, because you really are seeing that we are living through a truly Orwellian world. I mean, I had a gentleman who's he's a black gentleman, a friend, who wrote to me privately saying, I don't know what's happening, Gad, because my own family is disowning me because I'm not exhibiting sufficient purity when it comes to some of the protests that are taking place. He's a black gentleman, and yet he was somehow racist. So the purity test, his own family was coming after him. So this is Orwell, right? This is exactly what Orwellian lunacy is all about. So I'm not exactly sure what is the solution, but I think I do have a prescription. The silent majority, I think, is disgusted by this stuff, but they are held in check by, I think, the 8th deadly sin, which is human cowardice. If the silent majority chose to, in unison, collectively stand up and say, we will no longer tolerate this nonsense, then I think these problems will go away quickly. The problem is, it's difficult. It's a tragedy in the commons. It's difficult to get the whole group to, in unison, rise up. Rather, what they prefer to do is hide in the corner and then send me private emails saying, oh, I support you so much, Dr. Saad, but please don't mention my name. Well, don't you think that when you're saying, please don't mention my name, you are perpetuating exactly the problem that we're facing? If you don't even have the courage to simply state, I stand with you. Never mind you being at the forefront. You can't even stand with me. That's why we have the problem. So rise up and we can solve this problem. Don't, and we're only going to get worse.
And the problem, of course, is that I can understand people in academia worrying about their social and the prospect of social and professional death in academia by saying the wrong thing. But what is pretty disheartening is some of the politicians around the place who, you look at the current situation with all the rioting and demonstrating that's going on. So you had a sadistic brute in a police uniform killed somebody in Minneapolis and is rightly being charged with homicide. Yet somehow, all over the world, people are expected to see themselves as somehow implicated in this crime, kneeling down football players, kneeling entire teams unanimously. They all agree, apparently, getting down on their knees and pleading for forgiveness or whatever. But then you have political figures who do the same thing. Even in nominally conservative ones who you would think from their own point of view shouldn't be in effect disregarding their own support base. I mean, in Britain, for example, a couple of polls showed the support for this epidemic of tearing down statues and monuments. There's very small support in the wider community. The figures, 2 polls, 13 and 18% support for it. So you'd think a courageous politician could actually take a glove on, figuratively speaking, on this, but they don't. And that's the disturbing thing, I think.
Exactly right. Look, I often hear from people saying, well, aren't you exaggerating how, all this campus lunacy? Surely most students are not these crazy, super progressive activists. And my answer is, how many people did it take to bring down the Twin Towers? Was it 19 million? Was it 190 million? Oh, no, it was 19 people. In other words, it doesn't take a lot of people to cause massive damage and, cause a lot of us to then acquiesce and be quiet and be silent. So yes, it is true that when you walk around on campus, it is a small minority who hold a lot of these views, but they're a very loud minority. They're a minority that is so committed to their cause that it keeps everybody in check. So when you say 13 and 18%, it sounds like a small number, but it's a big enough number, which when coupled with human cowardice creates the perfectly fertile environment for everyone to acquiesce. You want me to kneel? Yes, boss, I kneel. And so on and so forth. And I always say, how could collective guilt be something that we are now promoting? How is it that the color of your skin, I call it dermatological original sin, right? It is now the case that if you are born of a certain hue, right, you are a white supremacist. Now, if you resent that, then you suffer from white fragility. So there's absolutely no way to get out of the fact that bottom line, you're a Nazi. All roads lead to bigotry. And it was ugly when people were bigoted to darker skinned people, and it's just as ugly to be bigoted against lighter skinned people. How about, here's a novel idea. How about we judge people based on their strengths and their merits and their flaws as individuals, and we reject identity politics?
Well, we'll go to the chat stream in a minute, but I'll just give you one. This seems to me the quintessential example of this kind of self-loathing mindset. The publicly owned broadcaster in Australia is the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and they have various intellectual programs, particularly on Sundays, which I enjoy listening to. I call them the funnies. But there's one called The Minefield, which explores ethical dilemmas, etc. And there was a program that featured the compere plus 2 critical race theorists from, discussing, and the title of the program was "Wrong to Be White." Right? It's wrong to be white, and the compere, about halfway through it, said this. Get a load of this. The great moral debility about being white is that people have willfully chosen the trinkets and accoutrements of the accretions of power and privilege over a much more fundamental bondedness with other human beings. That is, if we were speaking in a theological register, we would call that a tremendous or even radical sin. So saying being white is a tremendous or even radical sin. I think this sort of stuff marks a point where the identity politics ideologies transformed into a kind of crazy religious cult. What do you think of that?
Oh, I completely agree. Look, in the same way that traditional religions have revealed truths that are impervious to argumentation, right? I mean, there is no way for me to offer evidence-based thinking to move you away from some revealed truth of your religion, right? That's why it's called faith. Well, I think that the woke religion has the exact same cognitive structure. So you don't necessarily pray to a deity, but you do pray at the altar of a set of ideas that are revealed truths. We cannot debate them, right? So even in academia, before you had this ultra woke progressivism, there were some topics that were terribly toxic to study. So for example, sex differences in general are historically, very thorny topic to study. It's part of what some call forbidden knowledge. Because if the sex difference that you're studying comes out showing that the right sex is superior on that, say, cognitive task or motor ability, then you can publish it. If the sex difference comes out and for the wrong sex, then you better file that in the drawer quickly, unless you want to have your... Is this the type of scientific environment we want? I mean, it's insane. So I already saw this type of, forbidden knowledge creeping into academia well before it had made its way downstream to popular culture. And this is grotesque. Nothing is forbidden in a free society. We should be kind and polite and sweet to each other, but no knowledge is forbidden as long as you are true to the scientific method.
What's remarkable about it in terms of the religious analogy, it's got a whole eschatology. You've got a kind of original sin, being white.
Yeah, of course.
How do they think people who are in no sense privileged, who happen to have this it's kind of the reverse of the mark of Cain, about the old racist trope that black skin was the mark of Cain, you were sort of a particularly fallen being. It's just the weirdest thing that's happened in my lifetime.
Original sin would be one example of how to analogize the woke religion to traditional religions. Another example that I use in my book is the rituals of self-flagellation, right? We know that in many religious orders, across many different religious traditions, you have self-flagellation, right? I've committed, bodily sins, right? I've lusted, I've suffered from gluttony, all the things that we talk about in moral philosophy, the 7 deadly sins and so on. And one of the ways by which I could cleanse myself from many of these sins, right? I've been apathetic towards God. That's the most deadly sin, right? Being vain, having pride. And so I will engage in self-flagellation as a way to try to cleanse myself of these sins. Well, I argue that, the most pious thing that you can do as a progressive is to engage in civilizational self-flagellation, right? It's not at the individual level. Our culture is dreadful. My skin is dreadful. I'm a horrible human being. I'm from an imperialist society. I'm from a race society. And the more I self-flagellate, the more I am cleansing this supposed sins of my ancestors, and the more progressive I am. It's grotesque. It's an orgiastic self-loathing fest.
Absolutely. Anyway, we'll go to the chat. I don't know many of these we'll get through, but here we go. Professor Saad, welcome, and thank you for providing concepts and facts that I've incorporated in my article entitled The Agents and Instruments of Decadence, published yesterday on Quadrant Online. Yes.
I shared it actually on Twitter today. I shared it on yes.
So you can plug your book, he can plug his article. There you go. Welcome, Professor Saad. I enjoyed the video yesterday. I'm not sure
which one is this? Which one was it? But I don't know if they can answer.
I don't know. You might post in the chat window. Standing by. Good morning. Good morning. Dr. Saad, a warm welcome from this recondite corner of Blackheath, etc., etc.
By the way, I've been to the Blue Mountains.
Sorry?
You're in the Blue Mountains, right?
Yeah, that's right. Have you ever been here?
I've been. It's where the 3 sisters are, right?
Yeah, correct. Yeah,
I've been there. I have photos there. I'll even send you one.
Right. Oh, okay. Now, here we have Andrus Hex. Question: is not the political incorrectness of the Fox News Trump nexus that legitimizes lying a far greater threat to dissemination of the truth than any political correctness? Well, what do you make of that, Gad?
I think that there isn't a monopoly on how to be duplicitous. So I am sure that Trump engages in a lot of duplicity, but I also think that noble prophet Obama also engages in a lot of duplicity. So when noble prophet Obama stands up in front of the United Nations and says that the future should not belong to those who slander the prophet of Islam, is that a truth? Is that a good thing? So all politicians lie, all pundits lie. Regrettably, it's part of the repertoire of human realities. So it is not something that is restricted to Fox. When I listen to MSNBC or the other bullshit progressive stations in Canada and the US, they're all full of BS. So yes, of course, I don't doubt that Fox News spins the stories to fit their narrative, but I can assure you that the other gang are not any more noble in their pursuit of truth.
There is a good comment. Peter Baldwin, the quintessential 21st century man, an example of evolutionary philosophy. Well, modesty doesn't mean to say anything about it. I'd confer that on Gad. I don't know why anybody said that. Anthony Carr, is there something deep within the human psyche that makes moronic ideas forever appealing? If this is so, will occasional outbursts of collective folly be like the poor always with us?
Yeah, that's a good question. So at least when it comes to the idea pathogens that I cover in my book, I do try to explain what makes them appealing. Why is it that we can be parasitized by these ideas? And I offer, I think, a pretty compelling story. Maybe your viewers can tell me what they think. So I argue that each of these idea pathogens, in a sense, free us from the shackles of reality, right? So postmodernism frees us from reality, from common sense. It says up is down, left is right, man is woman, woman is man, men can bear children. So that's one way to look at it. It frees us. Let's look at the tabula rasa premise, or social constructivism. It basically says that we're all born with equal potentiality. When we're all born, we all start at the same line. Any of us could be the next Lionel Messi. Any of us could be the next Einstein. And the only reason why we don't meet our eventual potentiality is because something went wrong in the environment. Mommy didn't hug me enough. Maybe mommy hugged me too much. Maybe I ate too much McDonald's. Maybe I didn't eat enough McDonald's. So it is environmental realities that didn't meet my equipotentiality. Well, that's a very hopeful message. It's a very freeing message. It's a very noble message. And it's perfectly bullshit, right? Because there is something unique about Lionel Messi that would cause him to become the greatest soccer player. There is something about Michael Jordan with his ability to jump at a certain height that I could never jump, even if my mother hugged me all day, that makes it that he did start off with a better set of genetic cards than I did, right? But tabula rasa frees me of that. So to answer that question again, I think a lot of these idea pathogens are incredibly intoxicating, incredibly alluring, because they free us from the shackles of reality.
Okay. Delutha Pereira. Hi, Gad. Is much known about genomic imprinting when it comes to evolutionary psychology?
So there hasn't been too much rapprochement yet between evolutionary psychology and work at the gene level. It's starting to now increase. So you have studies that look at how polymorphism of a particular gene. Do you have the short version or the long version, the allele of that gene? Does that increase your likelihood of being a risk taker or not? So we're starting to see some bridges between analyses at the gene level and evolutionary psychology, but there hasn't been too much of that yet.
Christopher Carr, are too many so-called intellectuals into quasi-religion, which only requires faith, not rational argument and evidence?
Well, yeah, as we said earlier, I think intellectuals, in a sense, are replacing one types. I mean, many intellectuals, by the way, tend to be atheists. So if you look at studies that look at, the percentage of academics who have been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, I think the last study that I had seen from many years ago was something like 93% were atheists. So in a sense, many of the academics are, as we discussed earlier, are replacing one type of religion with another type, which shows you, by the way, that it's not always the case that being educated means that you'll be inoculated against superstitious belief, against irrational belief. You're simply replacing one form of superstition with another form.
Do you think this is evidence that humans, have some innate need for a religion of some kind, or an ideology which serves as a kind of quasar?
I do. As a matter of fact, in some of my own work, I've talked about the evolutionary roots of religion. I've even had guests on my show who are experts in this field. So, for example, Pascal Boyer, who is an evolutionary anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist at Washington University, is someone who has studied religion as an exaptation. So, just for your viewers to know, an adaptation is where a trait or a morphological feature has evolved because it confers either survival or reproductive advantage. An exaptation is a byproduct of evolution. So, for example, the color of our skeletal system is the color that it is, not because it has any adaptive value, but it's because it's a path-dependent thing. It's a byproduct of other evolutionary processes. So Pascal Boyer argues that we haven't specifically evolved if you like, a desire for religiosity, but rather religion piggybacks on neuronal systems that have evolved for other purposes. So, for example, our need to view the world through coalitional psychology, us versus them, red team versus blue team, is something that is very deeply ingrained in us. And guess what? Religion perfectly plays on that mechanism, right? So if you look at certainly the Abrahamic religions, there's always the us versus them. There are the Jews and the Gentiles, the believers and the kuffar in Islam, the ones who are going with Jesus, and the rest of you who are going to go to hell because you haven't accepted him in your heart. So you're taking a mechanism that already exists in me, and then religion comes in and piggybacks on it. So absolutely, I think so. Oftentimes people ask me, well, you seem to be hostile against religion. I'm not. As a matter of fact, I think we're never going to get rid of religion. We're never going to get rid of religion. What I'm usually hostile against is when religion tries to intrude on the rights of others. Believe what you want, do what you want, pray to whomever you want, as long as it doesn't, interfere 1 millimeter on the rights of others. And if that's the case, then we're fine.
Okay, Anthony K. Why are many people's belief systems so shallow that they are swept along by every new pathogen?
Well, I think I need to know a more specific example, but so I don't know exactly what he means. I think what I can tell you is that the idea of pathogens that I speak of, they seem to be targeting the left. So that might make people wrongly think that, oh, I'm arguing that only people on the left can be parasitized by idea pathogens. And that's absolutely not true. The reason why I focus on the left is because I exist in an ecosystem that is dominated by leftist thinking. So in the same way that a dermatologist focuses on skin disorders, not diabetes, I happen to focus on the left because those are the moronic ideas that I'm exposed to. Now, that doesn't mean that the right doesn't produce also moronic ideas. So, for example, anti-evolution thinking is much more likely to be espoused by, a Republican politician, right? Because they're much more likely to be anti-evolution. Interestingly, though, anti-evolutionary psychology is much more likely to be on the left. Right. So on the right, you have anti-evolution. On the left, you have anti-evolution psychology, which shows you that there is no monopoly to stupidity.
Okay. Question to Dr. Saad. Would you agree that faith and reason are both essential in the quest for truth?
No, I wouldn't. So here, let me explain it more broadly. There's a principle that was introduced by a late paleontologist called Stephen Jay Gould, the Harvard paleontologist. He basically argued for what's called the NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria. So meaning, hey, faith is here, reason is here, or science, and both can coexist. As long as they're non-overlapping, then why can't we have both? Well, that's a very nice accommodationist perspective. It's a nice kumbaya, let's hold hand, imagine John Lennon. But the reality is that they're not non-overlapping. Faith does make very specific statements about the nature of the world that is laughably falsifiable, right? So let's take the example of how old the earth is. depending on which religion you come from, there is a specific number that they offer. Now, when they want to try to contort themselves and engage in Olympic mental gymnastics, well, we don't mean that there are seven years, we mean it's 7 evolution, right? So they could come up with all sorts of post hoc ways to try to explain their religious superstition. But the reality is that these two spheres are not separate from each other. If you need religion to feel moral, that's fine. But there is nothing that is in the material world that is outside the purview of science, right? So it's not as though morality, the classic example is morality. Morality is simply outside the purview of science. You need theology to understand morality. Bullshit. Because I could take any of those books, say, I'm Jewish, take Deuteronomy, take the Mosaic codes. Well, in those books, I could see prescriptions of, quote, morality that are grotesquely immoral. Now, what people end up doing is they cherry pick, right? The 3 prescriptions that seem to be in line with their current beliefs, they take them. The 7 that they don't like, they say, well, that's probably meant to be something else. We can't quite understand God's reasoning and so on. So I don't need a Bronze Age book to teach me that I shouldn't be decapitating puppies. So no, I don't need faith to pursue truth.
Anthony Carr, Mike Bigot, in agreement with Anthony Carr, aren't climate change deniers in the grip of a quasi-religious conviction, if not worse, clearly unable to accept overwhelming scientific evidence?
Well, so I'm insufficiently knowledgeable about the veracity of all the climate science stuff. It seems to me, so I'm not familiar with the literature, that you're correct in stating that the great majority of scientists agree that climate change is happening. I think where the debate happens, and where certainly I would fall within the debate, is what should be the steps that we take in order to achieve a certain objective. So should we spend $100 trillion over the next 100 years? I'm making up these numbers. I'm not sure if they're right. So that we can reduce the temperature of Earth by 0.02%? Well, let's have that debate. So I think I can't speak to the reasons why the ones who deny climate change are doing it, but I think it is wrong to always argue that anyone who tries to, for example, argue that the Green New Deal of Ocasio-Cortez, I prefer to call her occasional cortex. So that particular, you like that, huh? That's my whole neuroscience part. So occasional cortex New Green Deal is certainly open to debate. Should we all return to using homing pigeons and smoking signals to communicate because Mother Earth shouldn't be raped? Well, maybe that itself is a form of eschatology, a form of extinction religion, right? The world is not going to end by next Wednesday. I can show you a million articles that have repeatedly said, look, by next Saturday, we're all dead, so have fun tonight. So somewhere between the hardcore deniers and the endless doomsayer is the truth. I don't know exactly where it is, but yeah, so that's it.
Andrus again. Question: do you agree with Rupert Sheldrake in his science delusion that science needs to move beyond materialism as a dogma to integrating the spiritual with the material?
So I don't know who Rupert Sheldrake is. I'm sure someone now will get super angry and say, how?
He's a Christian apologist.
So maybe it's great that I don't know who he is. Yeah, so I don't know about his theories. What I can tell you is I don't need, and when I say I mean any of us. I'm speaking in the first person, but it applies to anybody. I don't need religion to experience spirituality. When I meet someone new and they blow my mind by their kindness and intellect, that's a spiritual moment. When I go to the Grand Canyon and I see the majesty of nature, that's spiritual. So when I look at my Belgian shepherds and see their kindness and loyalty and how protective they are and how noble they are as creatures, that's spiritual. So I don't need to couch spirituality and the magisterial nature of life in a narrative of religion in order for me to be spiritual. On the contrary, I think you denigrate life by having to incorporate booga booga spirituality into the thing. Life itself is spiritual, is majestic, is magisterial. That's all I could say about this.
Barak Atzman Simon. I thought postmodernism was really about the idea that no one has ownership of the ultimate truth, not that my truth is the truth, and it is not about all and every proposition. This is a straw man. Ooh,
yeah, I mean, I love the cognitive bias of saying this is a straw man and then walking away as if it's a mic drop. No, it's not a straw man. Read Jacques Lacan, read Michel Foucault, read Jacques Derrida, and then come back and explain to me any of their sentences, because clearly, if you understand it, you are way more intelligent than me. They create edifices of bullshit, and then when you challenge them on it, they say, well, that's my hermeneutics. There's extraction of meaning that comes from the gibberish that I create. When Alain Sokal, the physicist, did the Sokal hoax in 1996, for those of you who don't know, what he basically did is he took postmodernist verbiage, which basically you can go online to random generators to create postmodernist essays, right? And he created a paper, a postmodernist paper on gravity, and it was accepted in one of the top postmodernist journals. When it was accepted, he then turned around and said, oops, I have a small admission to make. It's all bullshit what I wrote. Guess what the editors said? Well, that proves nothing, because we extracted meaning from your thing. So your truth and your bullshit is different. So it's not a straw man. Go back and learn what straw man means and then come back and talk to me.
Okay, Terry Sketcher, this is delicious. So glad I linked in. Well, you're welcome, Terry. Barak Atzman Simon again. Have you read, and if so, what do you think of the writings of Australian philosopher David Stove, e.g. Against the Idols of the Age?
This sounds interesting. Regrettably, I haven't, but maybe I need to put it on my list. Maybe you could tell me what it's all about.
Probably not. I don't think he's known much internationally, but he was an academic philosopher. But he sent all this stuff up in, he's deceased now, years ago, but he sent all this lunacy up in hilarious style. He wrote a book. I can't remember the title of it, but each chapter in the book had a section at the end, which was sort of a guide for young writers, which, had this hilarious account of how you can write stuff up in such a way as to, comply with the ideology. Very funny.
Well, I'll tell you very quickly, just to go back to a postmodernism point very quickly. I have a theory as to, I can't prove it, but there are hints that I might be correct. My theory is this. These postmodernists were walking around campus and feeling a great amount of envy at those other folks in the physics and chemistry department that people took seriously. But the problem, though, is that if I'm not a physicist or a mathematician, it's impenetrable, right? Within the first 3 lines of an academic paper in physics or in mathematics, if you don't know the language, you're already lost by the first syllable. Well, the postmodernists wanted to create an equally impenetrable language. And so if you go and read Jacques Lacan or Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida or all of their bullshit spawns after, it's exactly like that. You read passage after passage and you're unable to understand it. Now, the beauty of what they did is that they were able to rely on a human frailty called the fundamental attribution error, which is what? When I listen to Jacques Derrida pontificating from his platform at Princeton or whatever, and I don't understand the word, I have one of 2 options. I could either say, my God, this guy is full of baloney, or it must be that I'm too dumb to understand his profundity. And guess what most people's reflex is? I'm too dumb. So these complete charlatans were able to, for 40 years, parasitize the minds of endless people, when in reality, they were saying nothing of substance. As a matter of fact, Michel Foucault admitted to that in a conversation with the philosopher John Searle, and I talk about this in my book. John Searle told him, how come when I talk to you in person, Michel, you seem to make sense, but when I read your stuff, I can't make sense of any of it? He goes, well, because in France, if you don't write a whole bunch of obscure stuff that confuses everybody, nobody takes you seriously. So postmodernism is one big pile of bullshit.
Okay.
Now, by the way, I'll just say this. Postmodernism and, for example, understanding art movements might be something appropriate. But postmodernism as an epistemology carries zero weight. It explains nothing.
Okay. Now, we've got more comments by Anthony, Carr, and Christopher. I might just be, we're just running out of time, so I might try and get some of the people who haven't had their 2 bobs worth yet. Okay, Dale Turner. And thus the native view of resolution is sicklied o'er with the pale cast of thought and lose the name of action. Well, that's,
What the hell does that mean?
You tell me. I don't know.
I don't know. I'm not a poet nor a postmodernist.
Yeah, we've stumped you. We've stumped you.
Is there?
David
Sorry,
Horrocks. Is there only one breaker for this? David Horrocks. Is there only one breaker for this growing motion of civil behaviour? The horror of incivil behaviour, I think it means. The horror of totalitarian government.
What do you mean by one breaker? One outcome? What does that mean?
I don't know. This
Sorry, I don't
growing
follow the question.
I think what the point he's making is that the current lunacy will continue until people start to get a sense of that we're moving into an era of totalitarianism. I think that's the point he's.
I think there will be a correction. The problem is that if the correction happens tomorrow, it will be more nasty than if it happened yesterday or a week ago or a month ago. So in other words, I think eventually, good, clear-thinking people are going to rise up. But why rise up in 20 years when the problem will be much worse? In a sense, let's compare it to cancer. You could catch it at stage 1 or you can catch it at stage 4. You can still be cured at stage 4, but boy, it's a lot more complicated than at stage 1. So don't wait until the idea pathogens have metastasized into every nook and cranny of society, as they seem to be. And as I've been warning people for over 2 decades, deal with the problem early. Now, some people say, but we don't have the size of your platform. We're not some fancy schmancy professor. What can we do? Well, everybody has a voice. When someone says something at a bar with your friends and you disagree, don't keep quiet because you're afraid they're going to unfriend you. If they're going to unfriend you because you disagree with them, they're not worthy of your friendship. So in other words, each of us has the capacity to affect change in whichever size of an influence that we have. Some of us have bigger platforms, some of us have smaller platforms, but we all have a voice that we should use to affect change.
Okay, well, scrolling down, as I said, I'm prioritizing people who haven't had a say yet. Simon, will this mind parasite die or does it get stronger and stronger?
I mean, it depends which idea pathogen. Different ones, if you like, compare them to diseases. Some of them will kill you in 3 weeks. Some of them will take 5 years to kill you. So depending on the specific idea pathogen, the rate at which we can eradicate it will change. I think eventually we will be able to eradicate all these ideas. But my God, what a wasted effort, right? Had we not been so pliant, so open to all of this BS 40, 50 years ago when all of these dreadful ideas were being spawned in the university, had we attacked them head on then we wouldn't have, for example, what we have in Canada, which is a prime minister who is a walking manifestation of every idea pathogen that I enumerate in my book. And this has real consequences.
Isn't that the guy who wears blackface?
It is the guy who wears blackface, exactly. He is the guy who pushes...
That anti-racist.
Exactly. He's the guy...
Statues. Has he got these statues that can be torn down?
Undoubtedly, yes.
Okay, Deluta Pereira. This is proving to be an excellent way to spend a Saturday morning. Thanks, Peter and Gad. Well, wow.
Thank you. That's very kind of you.
Anthony Carr, is the desire to always be nice.
I'm feeling that Anthony Carr is getting too much of a monopoly. How about, I mean, some of your other people are going to no disrespect to Anthony Carr.
Now, Dale, is this again to... Anyway, here's somebody who hasn't had a crack yet. Chantal Murray Smith. One example of a simple concept that has become confused and complicated by gender studies and certain social sciences. XX plus XY equals necessary for propagation and evolution. It's a real thing.
You mean that a sexually reproducing species needs a male phenotype and a male and a female phenotype? Yeah, I think that is true. By the way, I had to appear in front of the Canadian Senate.
True, or is that just your ideological prejudice showing?
Well, maybe the tribe in the Japanese island that I spoke about earlier, maybe they procreate in a different way. But for most sexually reproducing species, this is how it happens. Now you have asexual reproduction, that's a different thing. But for sexually reproducing species, yeah, you do need this thing called male and female.
Okay, thinking Peter. He hasn't a go yet. All the controversial issues, including discussed. Oh, hang on, I'll get it up. Sorry. All the controversial issues, including discussed on this forum and social media, tend to be put on the back burner without a solution. Then we move on to the next. Twitter calls it "What's Trending."
So, meaning what he's saying, if I understand correctly, is we enumerate all of these problems, but we don't ultimately find a solution for them. Is that the problem? Is that the issue?
Yeah, that seems to be the point.
Well, but there is a solution, as I said. There's nothing magical about it. People have to rise up and debate against these ideas. If you give people free rein to push their bullshit, then the bullshit will propagate. If you stand up, if your professor says something that is grotesquely false, well, then challenge him or her in a polite way, right? But if you keep quiet because, well, if I say something, then my grade is going to suffer. Well, in that particular instance, in that particular interaction, truth was murdered in a small way. Now, magnify that interaction with hundreds of millions of other interactions where one person refused to offer a counterpoint lest they might be considered racist, homophobe, Islamophobe, climate science denier. Then what ends up happening is only one idea is being promulgated while there's no counterpoint. Speak up, develop some testicular fortitude, and hopefully we can have a solution to these idea pathogens.
David Steinman, could the source of the problem of intellectual postmodernism be their total separation from physical reality? The habit of working with matter, which is unforgiving of bullshit.
Yes, this is why, by the way, that's exactly right. This is why there aren't too many postmodernists at the business school where I'm housed. This is why there aren't too many postmodernists in the engineering school, because in those schools, in those fields, you are shackled by reality. You cannot develop mathematical models of economic systems rooted in bullshit. You cannot build bridges based on postmodernist tenets. There are physics rules that you have to abide by. So the postmodernists are able to proliferate in some of the humanities precisely because they exist in a world where their horrendous ideas are not coupled to real consequences. So they can pontificate in a highfalutin way from their ivory tower without any consequences. But if you're in the business school, you can't do that. If you're in engineering school, you can't do that.
Meredith Doy, Professor Saad, do you know of the Niskanen Center, a relatively new lobby in Washington, which it would seem is trying to find the evidence-based moderate center to show up the extremes?
I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds like an interesting thing. I'd love to learn more about it. I don't know it, though, no.
Okay. Now I'm skipping over those who've already asked multiple questions. Terry Sketcher, isn't a significant part of this problem doesn't a significant part of this problem lie in the way public opinion gets polarized, politicized and polarized? As risible as postmodernism is it at least a call to us to challenge traditional precepts?
I mean, you could challenge traditional precepts without murdering truth, right? So let me give you another very fun example, which I discuss in The Parasitic Mind. So I think it was in 1996, I had gone to visit a friend at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and he was teaching a class, so he was busy. So I decided to go to the Carnegie Museum and spend an afternoon, hanging around looking at art. And I saw a piece of art, which was an empty canvas. Now, I knew exactly what this was, but I wanted to challenge the people who put up that nonsense. So I asked, some person there to speak to the curator. And so they didn't send the curator of the museum. They sent someone else. Said, how could we help you, sir? I said, what is this bullshit on the wall? Why do you have an empty canvas? He said, oh, but this. I said, no. I get why am I paying to see an empty canvas? But don't you see, sir, it allowed us to have this organic conversation, right? So when empty art becomes one form of art, that's, again, in this case, the attack on my sense of aesthetics. By the way, subsequent to this, 20 plus years later, and I talk about this in the book, there was an exhibit on, you ready? You're all seated. They had an exhibition on invisible art. So,
Wow.
So you walked into a museum and the art was invisible. This wasn't Gad Saad satire. This was a real thing that was happening as part of art. Sorry?
They called it stealth art.
Stealth art, invisible art, exactly. And so in the book, I had written sarcastically, you know, it's ridiculous that I'm spending so much time writing this book with words. Next time, I'm just going to write a book that just has empty pages, and then the reader can interactively participate with me to create their own hermeneutics.
Rand, given the power grab of the radical left in humanities and recent gains in STEM, I just got a letter from Scientific American magazine, which confirms that. And high tech, are we at the cusp of a civilizational power recalibration? Is the West on the way out from the top spot?
Well, there are several things here. I mean, I definitely think that, as any historians who are watching the show will attest to, great civilizations often will fail, will implode from within. It's not there's the bad booga booga that comes at you from the outside. It's the excesses, it's the cancer from within that kills the great civilization. So I think to the extent that the West's power and influence is waning, I think it's coming not because there is a bad monster out there who will take over. It's because we have become completely parasitized by these idea pathogens. Now, I am an optimistic person. I wake up every day with vigor, hoping to help solve some of these problems. So I do think, as I said earlier, that we can redress the situation, but it is truly going to require collective action. Think about, now when people are listening to this chat, think about how many professors would have uttered 1,000th of what I just said in today's chat. Very few. Now, I'm not doing this to toot my horn. It should be something, what I'm saying is very obvious. And you know, there's nothing that I've said that's controversial. But in today's insane world, what I'm saying puts me at the periphery. I am non-orthodox, right? Saying that, well, it might not be true that men too can menstruate, puts me in the unorthodox position. I am with J.K. Rowling here. I'm one of those Nazis who actually questions whether men can menstruate. So when we have been so removed from a departure of reality, this is a problem, but we could solve it. But everybody has to speak up. I don't need to be receiving emails saying, wow, I love your work. Shh, please don't tell anybody that I support you. Stand up and say, I support reason, logic, science, and we can win this war.
Now, Gad, we're running up against your time constraint. Would you like to wind up now, or would you?
Maybe we could do one or two more, and then I can go and spend some time with my lovely family on this Shabbat dinner. Not that I'm religious.
Right. Okay. Well, what's this one here? What is the intersection between memetic idea pathogens and psychological disorder? Yeah,
that's good. So memetics, if you'd like. So the idea of a meme comes originally from Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, where in 1976, where he basically analogized a meme similar to a gene. So if a gene is what propagates at the biological level, well, memes, because we are also cultural animals, memes are packets of information that can propagate from one brain to another. If you read my book, I am infecting your brain with my memes. Religion is a memeplex. It's a collection of memes that can spread from one individual to another. Islam is a very infectious memeplex. Judaism is not. There are 14 million Jews. There's 1.5 billion Muslims. So the idea of a meme has already existed for 40 plus years. The difference with what I'm talking about with idea pathogens is in the valence, if you'd like, of the idea. A jingle could be a meme. Whether if I start humming a jingle and then you start humming it after me, in a sense, I have infected your brain with my jingle. But the valence of that meme is quite innocuous. Idea pathogens is if you'd like, they're memes, they're viral packets of information that lead the one who is parasitized with this idea down a maladaptive path. You follow what I'm saying? So that's really the difference between memetics and the idea pathogens that I talk about in my book.
Ian Lestrange, question: do you think that intersectional thinking has contributed largely to the victim cult, and do you think it's being misunderstood and wrongly applied with terrible consequences?
Right. So for those of you who don't know, intersectionality is the idea that, you know, I am a multiplicity of intersecting identities, and depending on those identities, I can either rise in what I call victimology poker or oppression Olympics or down. It's complete nonsense in the following sense. Very few people have experienced the horrors that I did in the Lebanese Civil War. By the way, my parents were subsequently kidnapped and tortured by Fatah, right? We were escaping death every second of every day during the Lebanese Civil War, right? So this is why, by the way, maybe I can get away with the things that I can get away with, because when people come at me with their intersexual victimology poker hands, I always outranger. I hold the royal flush, right? But how grotesque it is that I have to use those fascist tactics to defeat you at your game, rather than you and I sitting down with one another and hopefully I could convince you with the veracity of my ideas. So victimology is a terrible cancer. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't acknowledge where we come from, right? At the individual level, when you go into therapy, the therapist doesn't say, ignore your past. Let's work through your victim narrative, but then let's try to overcome it. But somehow, at the individual level, we should overcome our victimology. But at the group level, let's wallow in the victimology on issues that happened to our ancestors 400 years ago that have nothing to do with us. It's grotesque. It keeps people shackled by a victimology narrative, and it should stop.
Okay, this will have to be the last one,
Sure.
Rod Madry. Do you know the work of Frans de Waal on animal moral behavior circumventing any religion?
So, of course, I do know the work of Frans de Waal. He's a great primatologist who's done a lot of wonderful work on animal cognition and so on. I don't specifically know about, his work on, animal moral behavior, but the way I could answer it is as follows. Remember earlier when I talked about the idea of the NOMA principle, non-overlapping magisteria, and I said that morality is usually the place where the religious folks go to hide. They say, you can't explain morality through religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's been a million different studies that have looked at morality from an evolutionary perspective, and one stream of which looks at moral behavior in animals. And so Frans de Waal falls within that line of thinking.
Okay, well, that will have to be it. I apologize to the many additional chatters who, especially those who didn't get a question in. And I'd like to thank Gad. That was a most stimulating and interesting session, and we really enjoyed it, I think. And so thanks very much, and thanks to everybody who's participated today. And with that, I will click the button to end the broadcast.